John, Paul, George, and Ringo on Disney Plus. If you haven't seen it, you need to get back home and watch it. This is the Mouse and Men, where we explore the grown-up side of Disney. I am Bradley. I'm here with my co-caster, Chris. If you've been with us any length of time, you know there are three things we love: Disney, college football, and music. Like Beatles, Eagles, that kind of music. Today, we're talking about the Beatles because Get Back was released over Thanksgiving weekend. I think it's about 6 hours and 45 minutes worth of footage of them recording Let It Be. Chris, I watched it Thanksgiving weekend. I know you just finished it. What do you think?
Yeah. Oh, man. By the way, well done on the wordplay as we got started there. I loved it. I mean, again, as you said, college football, Disney, and essentially classic rock, but music in general is our wheelhouse. And we love talking about it all. And so whenever there is a cross of those things, it just makes me excited. And so when I heard about this Peter Jackson Get Back documentary, it's actually been a couple of years now. I was really excited. Yeah. And then to realize that it was going to premiere on Disney Plus, was I even more excited. But I realized that because each episode is 2+ close to 3 hours long, it's essentially watching the Lord of the Rings trilogy, or The Hobbit, all Peter Jackson things, all back to back. And so I have been watching it bit by bit over the last week and a half or so. Just finished it the night before last and have been in a Beatle paradise for the last week or so. So I thoroughly enjoyed it. I love the detail that they went in. And I think that Peter Jackson and company did a very good job on the documentary.
Yeah. Well, so we got started talking about Disney, college football, and music in the cab of a truck. And Chris, you told me, we should have a podcast and just hit record on these conversations. Well, this is going to be probably the closest thing to that because all we did was watch it. We do very little prep work for this show. You may have noticed, but there is no prep work. I've got no notes, nothing but junk on my desk. So let's jump into this week's episode of The Mouse and Men. Chris, huge Beatles fan.
Huge, yeah.
And you've heard the stories about what happened during these recording sessions. I didn't realize, and even more diehard Beatle fans probably did know, that they recorded this with the anticipation of we're going to write these songs, rehearse them, record them live in front of an audience, and videotape the whole thing. I didn't realize they were doing all that. And to see how it all went down over just a few weeks, and how fluid things were as they were changing, seeing the relationship between these four guys there at the end, it was really eye-opening and not what I had read in articles and books and things. It seemed totally different, and I loved it.
Yeah, me too. I was under the impression that, and again, spoiler alert, basically for the whole episode, because again, if we're going to record or talk about this as we used to in the truck all those years ago, we just chatting about music stuff. And so if you haven't seen the documentary, not necessarily giving anything away, the documentary is about an album that eventually came out and a film that went along with it, and then near the end of the Beatles' career. So if you know that much, then you kind of know at least the plot of this documentary. So we're not giving too much away, but going into some of the stuff I always thought that the Beatles broke up, and when they did, it was everybody was mad at each other. Everybody went their separate ways, and to a degree, it wasn't on the best of terms. But as we saw in the documentary, this was just mere months before they eventually broke up, and they were spending every day together. And a lot of new elements had made their way into the Beatles, with a lot of talk from the outside, new relationships forming and all of that. And so things led to the dissolution of the Beatles, but it wasn't as difficult and fights and arguments and that kind of stuff that I was led to believe before I watched this. And you could say that it was Peter Jackson trying to spin it in a different way than the public perception, but there is never any sort of like a commentator or a voiceover person talking you through this. Like in other documentaries, it's only the Beatles and it's only their words. And every now and then you'll see something on the bottom third of the screen to give you a bit more historical context, but that's really all it is. And so it's just showing the Beatles in their own words. And so, but instead of the fights, there were a few arguments, especially in the first episode and when they were still in Twickenham. But most of it was just them hanging out, goofing off, having fun, enjoying each other. You would think that a couple of months before the Beatles actually broke up, that it would have been a lot more difficult in those rooms. But they were being silly, hostile. Yeah, I mean, jokes and playing around with each other, and family were coming in and out, and girlfriends and future wives and all of it. It was a lot more of like a familial family atmosphere than the we're at each other's throats kinds of things that we eventually saw in that Let It Be documentary from what's his name, Michael Lindsay Hogg would go on to produce. It's like Michael Lindsay Hogg, however you pronounce it, who was in the documentary, and you see him walking around a lot. He was recording what would become a documentary called Let It Be that was released not long after all of this, but it showed the Beatles. It seemed like it was crafted in a way to show the Beatles kind of falling apart and much more at each other's throats than actually we saw in this 3-part documentary. So bravo to Peter Jackson, because it was a pleasure to watch.
Well, I know because I've watched a couple interviews with Peter Jackson since this came out, since I finished the series, the documentary. And when he first approached Paul McCartney about it, Paul was hesitant because Paul really only remembered the bad stuff, George walking out and just kind of the collapse of the Beatles, the collapse of what life was like for the Beatles, for John, Paul, George, and Ringo for over a decade. So he was Paul McCartney was hesitant, and Peter Jackson said, I'll only do things that really kind of cast a positive light. And I don't think it was contrived. It obviously wasn't scripted. But I don't think it was edited to show something that wasn't there.
Right.
Because I don't think you can hide that in over 6 hours of footage. You see them getting along great. You see what leads up to George getting frustrated and walking out. But you also see and you don't actually see it, but you know that the other three went to George's house, talked to him for a couple of days. They went to his house twice, and I guess reconciled enough to bring him back. But then he seemed to be having a good time again. At the beginning, he does not look like he's having fun, and by the end, he is having fun. It seems, and I don't know. It changed my perception of Yoko breaking up the Beatles. They all seemed fine. And I've heard Paul say, we knew that John was in this new relationship, and it was fine. We just made it work. Kind of the stories of it was only the 4 Beatles in the room for all of their recordings. Obviously that wasn't true because they had engineers and producers. And I know this one was kind of a special case because of all the cameras and everything, but it looked like they felt very comfortable with other people around. And bringing in Billy Preston,
what an addition.
Like they didn't want to do any overdubs, and they had kind of pioneered overdubbing with things like Sgt. Pepper's. I mean, that album is just fantastic, but it's got layers and layers and layers. And this album is just so raw, and I think that's some of my draw to it. And now I got to peek behind the curtain to see how it was made. I've been listening to that album since probably since Thanksgiving. Forget Christmas music. I'm listening to Let It Be.
Yeah, and now knowing of the options, ever since the documentary came out, I think the Glenn Johns version of the album Let It Be is now available. There is the original that was released with Phil Spector's additions, and then the Let It Be Naked that were there. So many different options to hear just the perspective of these different people, whether it's the Beatles / Phil Spector / Glenn Johns / George Martin back in the late 60s, or the Let It Be Naked in the 2000s. More of, as you described to me, more of Paul's influence in that one of getting back to the original. And now Glenn Johns, like what he would have released had he had complete control over it that just was released. And so, and again, with all that, with the addition of the documentary to watch, and then going back and to compare it to what the original Let It Be documentary showed, just so many different perspectives. But again, goes back to show me that like George had a voice. I always thought, being the quiet one and always kind of soft-spoken in and of his own right, that he was just kind of rolled over by Paul and John all those years. But he actually had an opinion and he voiced it and they listened to them. And it seemed like they were trying to get more comfortable with it, not just being the Paul and John show, and allowing Ringo to put additions in there, and then George to put his songs in there too. It was showing a band that I feel like that if they could have gotten over a few hurdles, that they could have had several more albums in them, even if they just recorded them in the studio and then did not go and tour to support it. But yeah, pleasure to watch and to change my perspective. Again, Yoko, although I heard Paul say in a couple of interviews that I've watched too, that like, yeah, it was a bit odd to think that it was just the four of us, at least around those instruments. And then all of a sudden, without really asking permission, John just had a person in there that was like, who's just sitting on my amp kind of thing. But they got used to it. And again, as you were saying, that like Paul said that they realized that John was in love and wanted to respect that as well. And so it was a bit, it was something to get used to, but something that all of the other Beatles seemed to be supportive of.
Yeah. And like you said, getting to see George's influence, getting to watch Ringo. I mean, Ringo's just always been one of those, yeah, that's cool kind of guys. But seeing him through this whole, I mean, it was the month of January, and seeing them just, I mean, there's chaos, there's trying to work out stuff, and Ringo's just there. And I think somebody pointed this out. Nobody ever told Ringo what to play. There may have been one time that they told Ringo what to play, but he just instinctively knew. But it was so cool to see that, and to see George working out songs, to see all of them writing songs, to see Let It Be and Get Back just kind of plucked out of thin air. Seeing, they just sit down and they like a melody, and they're putting in random lyrics just to fit the meter, to fit the melody, and they'll go back and change it later. As a songwriter myself, it's cool to see how the greatest songwriting partnership did it. Sometimes they come in with something, sometimes they're fiddling around and come up with something.
Yeah.
But oh man, I could go watch it again right now. I could watch the whole thing. I don't like to sit still, but I could watch all 6+ hours of it in one sitting. I love the Beatles that much.
Man, I tell you what, it was so cool to see how oftentimes just they're sitting there with their instruments and they've got a microphone in front of them. And other than that, it's just like, let's just be silly and see what comes out of this. Let's just throw away the version that we're currently working on, and we'll do it in a different meter or something like that. And a lot of it wasn't actually said like that. It was just, they'll start playing and they'll start riffing, and then you'll hear a little bit of that riff that just kind of came out of nowhere as a surprise. It made its way into the final song.
Yeah.
And then to see that, like, over the course of that month, when they started out in that big cavernous Twickenham studio, and then moved to Seville Row, where where the Apple headquarters are,
Yeah.
to see, like, over that whole time of just, like, there would be a break and Paul would sit down and start playing around with something that would become, over weeks, Let It Be. But it was just like this, it was little chord progression that turned into and then, he would have a dream about his mom saying Let It Be or whatever, and then it would work its way into the lyrics. It's fascinating to see somebody who my whole life I've just looked up to as these rock gods,
Yeah.
and to see how a lot of the process was stripped away enough for me to see that these were just humans that were very creative, and they were around a lot of other people that were very creative. No wonder they came out with such like culturally shifting music, time after time after time, because they figured out the process that worked for them, and they kept going at it.
Well, in just being able, because I've sat in rooms, just rehearsal, but not a lot of schedule, and jamming happens, and you come up with some great ideas, and that's all very cool. So getting to see the Beatles do that was awesome. Also, I mean, I knew where this documentary was headed. I knew it was going to end with the rooftop concert. But from the very beginning, you're not sure if it's going to happen. And that's one of the reasons why we're doing this kind of review so soon, is everybody knows how it turns out.
Yeah.
Everybody knows what happens with the Beatles. Everybody knows there was a rooftop concert. Everybody has heard the album. So it's not like we're really giving anything away. But I'm sitting there like, how are they going to pull this off? And they say the roof's not going to support the weight. And, people are getting mad that they're hearing this noise. But then also seeing because I'm listening to it, I'm like, that version of Get Back doesn't quite sound like the album. It's a little fast. It's a little slow. The lick isn't there. And then you get to the rooftop concert and you get the little footnote down at the bottom. It says this, this take ended up on the Let It Be album. And knowing, okay, not only did they track live in the studio, they were recording the entire rooftop concert to see if they wanted to put any of that on the album. And that was just fantastic because it was freezing cold. It was frigid.
Yeah.
And it's so hard to play and sing when it's cold. Just once again, hats off to the Beatles.
Yeah. I mean, to that point, I know how hard it is to play guitar when it's cold and to sing when it's cold, but to see how few mistakes they made, and you can hear the mistakes when they're made. They keep it in there. They keep the volume up. They don't try to overdub them for us as the audience to watch, to give any other different perspective of the Beatles than what they were. But the fact that they were that cold and they were noodling around on the guitar, especially John and George, the ability for them to be able to be accurate with so many of those chords and notes that they were playing, it blew me away. And again, at this point, it's 1969. They have been playing as a band, as the Beatles, as the world's biggest band for close to a decade. Before that, they had years where they were playing in the Cavern Club or in Hamburg, Germany, night after night. So they have well put in their 10,000 hours. They are consummate professional musicians at this point. They're not just upstarts that picked up a bass and a guitar and a drum set and tried to go to town. But still, with that amount of pressure and weather and all of that going on, and with the cops, I don't know that they knew when it was all going on the rooftop how much that down below the cops were trying to shut them down the whole time. But all of that pressure, and to still see that they were putting out tapes that now are iconic pieces of classic rock or just music in general. It's amazing to see how well they performed under all that pressure.
It truly is. I love it. I can't get enough of it. Really. And so that's what I want to talk about for plussing, is how we can get just a little bit more of the Beatles.
Yeah.
So here's plussing. Chris, take it away.
Well, for us, we aren't casual fans of the Beatles. We aren't casual fans of music in general, especially classic rock. And so watching a 6 to 8 hour documentary is something that I'm willing to put the time into because I would take even longer. I would watch each one of those reels that Peter Jackson got in. They said something like, 60 hours of video footage and at least double that, if not triple that, of just audio that they were able to create this out of. And so I think that I could have watched every bit of it, even the outtakes of just somebody scratching their nose or singing a wrong note or whatever. But that's for me. I'm a big fan, and I want to go into all of this. For those of you that start watching Get Back and like, oh my gracious, I'm going to sit here for the next 6 to 8 hours to get through this story. There is a documentary on Hulu that's more serial. It's 6 episodes. It's called McCartney 3-2-1, and it's just Paul McCartney, Rick Rubin, a super producer, and a board, and they bring up music from either the Beatles or Paul McCartney's time with Wings or his solo stuff, and they just talk through music. And so, if you love the Beatles, but maybe not enough to sit there for 6+ hours to watch a full documentary on just one of their albums, McCartney 3-2-1 over on Hulu, that's also Disney owned, is a great recommendation for anyone who wants to learn more about the Beatles, but maybe doesn't want to sit there for that long. So I'd recommend anybody go do it. It's filmed really nicely. It's all black and white, and it's cool, and it looks like just to hear some of those perspectives on McCartney and some of those songs that we may not hear him talk about as much. It's a great series, and Rick Rubin, being such a consummate producer himself, does a really good job of asking the right questions and checking, going in deep with that. So can't recommend McCartney 3-2-1 enough.
Well, you better believe that's what I'm going to be watching next, because I didn't know about that. I don't. Well, with a new baby in the house, I don't hear about a whole lot of stuff. I'm lucky just to read the back of my eyelids, but this is so good. If you are a Beatles fan, you don't have to watch it all at once. Like we tried to do. You can break it up. But yeah, if you have some time over the holidays, definitely worth watching to see some behind the scenes of the greatest band of all time.
It's inspiring, man. I mean, it inspired me even to grow a mustache out for this holiday season, just because 3 of the 4 Beatles in the documentary had some kind of facial hair going on. So this is me repping Beatles style, even though the more that it grows out with my hair, I look more like Frank Zappa than George Harrison, but I'm trying. Yeah,
I love it. Well, go watch the Beatles, go listen to the Beatles. You can't go wrong. And I love exploring history like this. I love learning about some of my favorite childhood bands, also my favorite bands as adult. You can't grow up too fast.
Oof. Man, and I tell you what, thank you, Disney, for all of this, because I could take 6 to 8 more hours of this treasure trove that is the Beatles Get Back. So thank you, Peter Jackson. I'm glad that the Beatles that Disney gave this to us. And the more I'm learning about them, the more I want to keep exploring. And so find your passions, find what you love, because you got to keep exploring.